Hi, everybody. Today I have Sigatrev with me, known for many things in ITG and also one of the creators of Rhythm Horizon. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
So we gotta start this the same way we start every one of these. How did you get into dance games?
Oh, let's see. It was the summer of 2002, and a friend of mine and I went to some all-you-can-play arcade type where you pay at the entrance and play as much as you want. And I'd never heard of dance games, but they happened to have one, and I gave it a shot and thought it was kind of weird. And then I got the itch.
You got the itch.
I got the itch. I had to play it again, and then almost 20 years later, here I am.
Beautiful. What machine was the machine that you played on?
So I don't actually remember that for sure. I know that when I went to a arcade that was closer to my house to play like for real, like actually starting to play regularly, it was Third Mix Plus.
Ooh, that's a good mix. That's a very good mix. I know a lot of people. That's one of their favorite, like I don't want to call you a boomer, but like the OG dance game people.
Basically, it's only 19 years. Close enough.
Only 90s, yeah. 20 sounds better, maybe a bit more sage-like. So then, how'd you get into ITG? Was it like a natural progression?
Yeah, so even with DDR, I tended to gravitate towards the harder songs they had available. And I remember when Extreme was around before, I don't remember if it was before ITG was out or just before I had access to it. I'd like play PSMO Shuffle No Bar as like, you know,
Yikes.
looking for harder stuff to play.
Uh-huh.
So yeah, when ITG was out, I don't think I had a ITG one machine near me ever. I know one summer where I was basically living and working out of town, there was an ITG one machine close to where I was at the time, and I played some ITG one then. But the arcades near where I normally lived, I think ITG two was the first ITG mix they had.
Yeah, I think there's only like a couple ITG ones. Yeah, I know there was one in Schaumburg, Illinois, at GameWorks. That's the one that I played on.
Yeah, the one I was playing on was Pinball Pete's in Ann Arbor.
So then, okay, you were a no bar player for a while. Why did you stick with that for so long?
I stuck with it because I don't know, I liked playing harder stuff and I liked being able to do it without the bar, and then it was just a little bit of extra challenge. But then when customs really exploded, uh, extra challenge became available just through harder content. And so eventually my desire to just play harder and harder stuff drove me to switch.
A lot of the, I guess, in the groove fans of this channel are gonna know you from the Tachyon pack series, and kind of creating foot speed. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So I guess the sort of broader story goes. I mean, it sort of encompasses all of the early history of custom content in ITG. Like the very early custom content for that was played by ITG players on ITG machines was just Stepmania keyboard content. They're like One More Lovely, Strange Program, Vertex Beta, that kind of stuff was like big. Um, and then once R21 came around and people started hacking machines, also, um, there people started making custom charts specifically for ITG players to be playing. And at the time when I eventually started working on the Tachyon packs, the meta was Dragon Force was a big thing, and the Dragon Force charts were really long. And I'm sorry to Cosmic Pope, but they weren't very good.
Oh,
I didn't love them, and I was like, I prefer shorter, faster things, and there isn't a lot of stuff that really fits what I'm looking for. So let's make something.
what was the initial, I guess, reception to the Tachyon foot speed stuff?
That's hard for me to say. I know certainly in hindsight, the first Tachyon pack seems kind of like garbage. It was very heavy in drills, which have fallen out of favor. But at the time when pads were cratery and it was not possible to slide between panels as you do today, that was a little bit more relevant. But the even Tachyon Beta didn't, you know, keep that technique around.
Okay.
But yeah, I think it was the reception overall. I think was decent. I think people were happy to have something that was a little different than the stuff that was out there.
Kind of going past like later in the Tachyon series, so like they kind of started getting established. You started running Bearpocalypse tournaments. What? Why did you do that? What was the motivation behind that? What were they like?
Sure. So the typical tournament format at the time, and I think this has persisted largely. I think these structured tournaments are still around, but the format at the time was pretty much always you have some pack of songs, you make some kind of a ladder, you have two people playing against each other directly. They each pick a song, and if they each win, the scoring was like it matters if you win a song, and it's considered equivalent if you win by one excellent versus if they don't hit a single arrow and you get 100%. Like there's no difference in the amount you win by. It's just you won or lost the song. And then if you both win one song, there's a random, and you both play the random, and then you sit down for multiple hours before you play again.
Yeah.
The organizers of these tournaments had started to put some harder content in the packs, but it was like a very small number. And I think at the same time, they were also putting bell curve weights on the random song selection. So not only were there very few harder charts to begin with, but the random was more likely to be from the middle. So it was just like a vanishingly small chance that a hard song would ever show up there. So if you're into hard stuff, like the chances of getting through a single round, if you're not like also good at the easy stuff, is pretty low. And also, it's just not really that fun to play really hard charts, not warmed up, and then sit down for multiple hours, and then maybe play another really hard chart unwarmed up. It just didn't seem like the right way to enjoy that type of content. And if you really want to like compete on that stuff, to me, it's more interesting to have people competing at their best rather than on the spot. So I came up with the idea of you have some time to warm up. You play all the stuff you're going to play back to back. You can potentially get multiple tries on it. You basically play almost like a normal session, just with some goals sprinkled on top of that. So that was sort of the idea. And then as they went on, the rules got tweaked and adjusted, both to keep things fresh and to try and improve the structure of the tournament.
So then let's talk about that a little bit. Like, how'd you create the rules to achieve that goal? Like, do you have any specific examples of things that worked, things that didn't work, things that changed over time?
Yeah, sure. So pretty much every tournament had a different rule set. I think the last two were probably the most similar, but the first one, I think I had like a pre-selected list of charts that I had picked out. I can't remember exactly, but there were so in all of them there were two different sessions, and your scores from them were essentially added between them. In the first, I think, four Bearpocalypse tournaments, the two sessions had essentially different targets you'd play towards, and so you could choose in one session to play towards one target, and in the other session play towards the other one. And you could do them in either order. I think no, not in the first one, but in the other ones, I guess the second one you couldn't either. It's been a while. So.
It's totally fine. I'm sure someone in the comments is gonna be like, "Well, actually, Bearpocalypse won."
Yeah. So I don't remember all of the details of the rules of Bearpocalypse 1, but I think the main thing was that I let each person who was involved, I think I let everybody pick a song, and then we'd play those. Like that was like I think the first day, and I think the second set was I think everybody picked 3 songs maybe, and we drew out of a hat to decide what was actually going to be played. So like one of it was sort of direct choice, the other one was more randomized.
Okay.
But it was all from a preset song list, and that had some pros and cons. But the content you ended up playing was a little bit mixed, and some of it, well, I don't know. It was harder to predict, harder to know ahead of time what to prepare for. So in the second Bearpocalypse tournament, the rule format changed instead. So for the first of the 2 sets, there was 3 lists of charts. I think there were 6 charts on them. There was a foot speed list, a stamina list, and sort of a mixed list. And you had to play all 6 songs on the list, and we just take the sum total of your score, and that was your score for the first set. And then for the second set, I think there were 6 pairs of charts, and you had to play one chart from each pair. And so you could choose, which of them they'd be. And they would be paired sort of, they were similar. A more stamina-oriented chart paired with a stamina chart, like a 250 BPM, just two different options at 250 BPM or at 230 or whatever. And then, we just sum up the scores you get on those.
Okay.
And so that was sort of how the second tournament worked. The third one, I think, God, I can't remember exactly. I'm a little blurry on the third and fourth, but anyway,
That's fine.
So the second tournament had from my perspective, a flaw. When I designed it, 18s were sort of the hardest thing anybody was doing, and so like the sets of like speed, stamina are mixed. I think they ranged 16 to 18, and then when you had to pick from the pairs were like two 18s paired together. But by the time the tournament ran around, I was doing 19s and maybe even some easy 20s, and I ended up actually not winning that tournament.
Oh wow. Oh, so
Yeah.
you didn't win the tournament. That's why the rules are flawed.
Yeah. No, I mean, the point of the tournaments was to play the hardest stuff you could, and this stuff was nowhere near the hardest stuff I could do.
Yeah, so you can flex on people. That makes sense.
I mean, there are no prizes for these tournaments. It was like, the point of it largely, from my perspective, was to try and drive people to play harder and foot speed stuff. And to motivate them to do so. And having a cap on the difficulty, I don't think really supports that goal so well.
Yeah.
So from the third one on, there was like a list that went way beyond even what I could do in terms of what charts were available to play. A large part of the goal for the Bearpocalypse tournaments for me was not so much finding a winner as it was just encouraging people to play really hard stuff and to get together and come to this event with other people who like to play the same kind of content. And to make it like exciting and enjoyable for the people who are playing. But I mean, I think in general, a lot of competitions, dance game or otherwise, tend to focus on like they're more interesting when it's actually competitive and you don't know ahead of time who's going to win. So what your goal is for the tournament, I think, really influences how the rules end up being put together.
You also made Final Fantasy Tactics and then a Super Meat Boy theme that I don't know if got released or not. So what was your motivation for making those themes? Why did you go out and make the Final Fantasy Tactics theme?
Yeah, so I bought an ITG machine in 2010, and people had been making themes to hack onto ITG machines. Most of the themes were recolors. I wanted to make something different, but I am not very artistically inclined. So designing like my own UI for something, kind of like I knew it would not turn out well if I tried to do that. So I love Final Fantasy Tactics. It's an amazing game. I have played a very large amount of it over many, many years, and I thought it would be pretty cool to make a theme that looked like Final Fantasy Tactics. And then as I went, I wanted to just kind of implement more sort of crazy, weird features like the class selection thing and all that stuff, and make it look like the game. And I just kind of plugged away at it for quite some time.
This is something that I noticed during this time, that theme had like distinguishing features, like the class selection system that you had. Why did you include the class selection system?
Because that's like the coolest part of Final Fantasy Tactics is the class system. Like, that's the fun part. I mean, playing the game is fun, but like that's the first part I always think of when I think of the game, is it's like the class thing and the switching class. And I mean, it's completely pointless. Like, it doesn't affect ITG gameplay, but like, it's cool.
It is cool. It is cool. It was always fun watching YouTube videos with the little character shuffling around on the screen and stuff like that.
And as like a related note, the sort of techniques that I came up with for doing that was in the Super Meat Boy theme I made, you could choose which Super Meat Boy world you wanted to play in. That was essentially the same underlying like handling. It's just like you cycling through the different things. The color selection in Simply Love is the same thing again. That was like added to Simply Love because I already knew how to do that from doing those other themes. I was like, Laura was trying to come up with like how to color things, and I basically suggested that we could make it selectable.
Interesting. That's very cool. So then after, I guess after ITG, so it's kind of safe to say that there's a lot of aspects of the game that you kind of, if you didn't revolutionize, you kind of like innovated them. All of this amalgamated to Rhythm Horizon, it seems.
Yes.
So what was that transition like? Why did you start Rhythm Horizon?
Sure. So that part of that goes back to sort of a continued discussion of the theming stuff. So at the time when I made the Tactics theme and the Super Meat Boy theme and the I worked some amount with Laura on Simply Love. She sort of made the original thing, and then eventually I helped add a bunch of technical features on top of it. This was all done in Stepmania 3.95, which was much, much more limited in terms of what you could do than Stepmania 5 is. And it was closed and static. You couldn't add new things to it. And so at some point I sort of, there were a lot of things I wanted to do that I could not figure out ways to do in 3.95, and it kind of at some point seemed like it was a limiting factor and that it wasn't what people were going to stick with forever. I think at the time, Stepmania 5 still hadn't had a non-beta release. So, that was certainly before it was, widely accepted, at least by the dance game, or at least the ITG community. But essentially, I decided that it was, I wanted to start experimenting with that and see, like, some of the things we could do there.
Okay.
A sort of overarching theme of a lot of the things that I've been involved with in the dance game community, from the themes to the writing charts and making packs and the tournaments, has all been about trying to, I love dance games, I love playing them, but there's aspects that I thought could be better, and I wanted to try and make those things better.
Okay.
And so when I, switched to essentially messing around in Stepmania 5, for a long time, I'm not sure how long, maybe 6 months, I was just kind of messing around with themes. And then Laura and I were talking at some point, and I don't remember exactly how the idea for the project started. It was not even initially a 9-panel thing. It was just, there's sort of some larger systemic problems, like where do you find content? How is content, score tracked? How do you get people sort of to come together on these things? And one of the both blessings and a curse of Stepmania is, anybody can make their own content, but there was no centralized stuff. So the community, there were like fragmented communities all over the place.
It's still fragmented too.
I'm well aware. And, to some degree, it's kind of silly to try and solve it by making something new, because then you're just adding another fragment on top of it. But we'll ignore that part. Anyway, and there's also, plenty of other things we wanted to fix, like people arguing over difficulties. So anyway, we decided like we'd start making something that would try and be something more than just a theme or a pack. And initially, actually, for even the first 6 months of after we had started, it took us quite a while to come up with a name, but it was what ultimately turned into Rhythm Horizon. It was still done like as a Stepmania theme. Bearpocalypse 4 was using an early prototype of that. It was essentially a theme at that point.
I noticed that you're not saying the name that it was. Is that name like forbidden or something?
No, we literally just did not have a name. Like, people colloquially called it Stompers because we didn't give a name because we had not landed on one. But anyway, so like it started as a Stepmania theme, and then at some point I realized that that was not really the best way to go about this, and
Why not?
there are a lot of reasons, but like as I was going, I kept like exposing new things to Lua that were done in the engine. I'd make changes to the engine to add a little bit of functionality here or there that wasn't things you couldn't do theming at the time. But like I was basically trying to duplicate a bunch of systems that should have been done in the engine through a theme. So that's inefficient. There's a lot of duplication there. And it's harder to keep things sort of working and in sync. There's more challenges without having a pre-compiled language. And the direction Stepmania was going at the time was not really one that seemed relevant to us, and Stepmania as a program had lots and lots of stuff in it that wasn't relevant to us. And so I decided to, ultimately fork it and remove all the stuff that didn't matter, and then replace a bunch of stuff that wasn't what we wanted. And it just kind of evolved from there over time.
Okay, so you have which Stepmania did you fork? I think is this a meme? I feel like this was a meme recently.
I don't know. I don't know if it's a meme.
Okay,
It was, I think, around the time of beta 5.04, or beta 4 is what they called it. I
okay,
think in the newer, they eventually, like, I forget which one the last beta was, but if beta 5 was the last beta, then the first release was 5.0.6. So like the beta numbers sort of continued on to the release numbers.
gotcha. We haven't gone over this yet. We should probably clarify. What exactly do you do for Rhythm Horizon? What is your role or roles?
I do everything involving the game client. I do most of the design of the features that are going to be in the game. That's pretty much it.
Okay, cool. When you say design for the features in the game, do you mean like from a coding perspective or like a whiteboarding general perspective? Like,
Both.
okay,
Really, it's both. So like, someone will suggest a feature, we'll come up with a feature, and the first thing I'll do is start poking at the edge cases to try and figure out how it's going to break down when somebody uses it in the way that's not the absolute like intended design for it.
so you mentioned discussions about difficulty, and I think this is one of the more interesting features of Rhythm Horizon is that y'all have a difficulty algorithm. So people don't put their own difficulties in. You choose the difficulties through uh, codes and blips and bloops and that. Could you give us like I guess a history of this? Not necessarily like with the ITG community, but like why you wanted to do this? What problems are you trying to solve?
Sure. So the ultimate problem I was trying to solve was the fact that nobody could agree on difficulties ever, and two people would give a different number to the same chart, and one person would give two different numbers to the same chart if asked on two different days. Um, it's it's just kind of like a bad system, a very inconsistent system. Ratings change over time, and when there's content in sort of new areas, it's impossible to rate because ratings are all relative to other things, and if there's not enough relative things to compare to, then you can't really make any kind of judgments. So my goal was to try and just do it with an algorithm, and there's a lot of benefits to that. Even if the algorithm isn't fully accurate, it's still at least going to be consistent. It will always give the same chart, the same rating, until you change the algorithm, at which point it changes for everybody everywhere. You don't have to like go through and re-rate charts, and then people have different, one person has the chart rated as one thing and somebody else has it rated as something else. When you use an algorithm, it can just be applied everywhere all the time. So the initial evolution of it, so it's gone through a lot of stages over time. Um, at this point, the analysis of patterns, which to us means which foot is going to hit which panel, is the vast majority of the code. But early on, it was the so our algorithm is sort of split into three parts overall. Like currently, we've got sort of a pre-pass that sets up some of the data structures. We have a pattern analysis pass that figures out which foot is hitting which panel, and that's done through a cost minimization approach. And then currently, the end part has always been a density analysis, but since we switched to a cost model approach, it's a cost density analysis rather than a node density analysis. Okay. So early on, we just try to analyze the sort of density of the notes in general. So my sort of observations from playing was with regard to the relationship between the length of something and the speed of it and their effect on difficulty. I saw the increase in difficulty with respect to speed as being linear with speed. As you keep adding speed, it keeps adding the same amount of difficulty. And I saw it being logarithmic with length, meaning you double the length of the stream, it adds some difficulty. You double it again, it adds the same difficulty. Double it again, adds the same. So I wanted to sort of codify those relationships. So that was sort of the starting point, and ultimately, I spend a lot of time sort of tweaking things, but the way that part broadly works is I average the density over different ranges of notes and different ranges of times and sort of have sliding windows, and I walk through looking at the densities over those periods of time to ultimately spit out a number at the end.
Gotcha.
And that ends up working fairly well when you encounter something like you could have a chart with a long stream, then you add a tiny little break in the middle, and how does that affect the difficulty? Then you make the break longer and longer and longer, and what effect does that have, like incrementally as you go?
Yeah.
The approach we're ultimately going with, still using today, handles that pretty well. And interestingly enough, that part of the algorithm is almost unchanged since like the Bearpocalypse days.
Okay.
It was largely tuned on like high-end 4-panel content, both foot speed and stamina, and we don't have that kind of high-end content in RH yet, at least nowhere near the variety of it. And yeah, it's tuned pretty well, and it works pretty well, so I just haven't had to make any adjustments there.
Yeah, it's also like I mean, relative to tech, a more simple problem to solve, right?
Yeah, it is.
How long you streaming for, how quickly breaks.
But also like even beyond that, like when you get it wrong, you don't get it nearly as wrong. Like if you slightly mistune the weights of these, like the different lengths of streams or whatever, it's going to cause a minor change in number. Whereas if your pattern analysis is wrong, you might say an entire stream is crossed or you're facing backwards when that is just insane and nobody would do that.
How do you codify, I guess, like tech that you don't know about, right? Because 9-panel is still very new in terms of its meta, right? Do you future-proof yourself against that? Do you even worry about that?
So I don't necessarily explicitly worry about that. I mean, the general point of the algorithm is to choose which foot is going to hit which panel, and I tried it. It's as I said, we use a cost minimization approach here, and by cost that really means the difficulty of hitting this individual step, and that difficulty of the individual step is based on not just what you're hitting or where your other foot is or how long it's been since you used which foot. Like there's a lot of different things that go into that, but a lot of that is largely just based on the physical mechanics of your body. Like we know that if you're moving faster, it's more difficult. If you're have to move from like the down left corner of one pad to the up right corner of the other on doubles, that's a huge distance and that's more difficult. If you're crossed, that's more difficult. If you're, if it's a double step, your foot has been used. It hasn't been as long since you used your foot, so there's the time issue there. But there's also sort of there's a balance advantage to alternating. So even beyond just the speed, the single step as a double step is harder than, it would otherwise show up as. So we sort of account for all of these things, and then occasionally there will be techniques that sort of that we don't know about yet. Or that we aren't necessarily fully handling perfectly yet. There are some things that end up being a little tricky to fully codify. Some of the examples of this would be we have some tracking for, there's a lot of different ways in 9-panel to have 2 panels or more, up to 4, that you can hit with a single foot at a single time. So we have different costs for if they're vertically adjacent or diagonally adjacent or horizontally adjacent, or if you're hitting 3, which are always going to be some combination of that, or all 4 at once. But if you can also have a case where you're holding one panel and then hitting with the same foot a tap that's adjacent to that. And initially we used the same costing for both of those, and as time went on and I looked more and more at our pattern analysis and found cases where we weren't doing things right, I realized that that was not quite the right approach for that. And we needed to have like separate costing for those, because if you're holding something with your toe and hitting with your heel, that's a lot easier than if you're holding with your heel and hitting with your toe. Doing it horizontal versus vertical, versus diagonal, the way that affects the difficulty is sort of different for. We call them hold anchors. It's different for hold anchors than if you're just hitting 2 things at the same time. So we largely, I just I have some suite of charts that I've selected, mostly full charts. Occasionally it's just a snippet of a patterns, but I have like a bunch of tests, and I have basically programmed in what the results of the pattern analysis should be. And when I make tweaks to the pattern analysis, I make sure that, it's still getting those things right. And when I find a chart that we're not doing right, some part of it, I will add that chart as a test, tell it
Yep.
how it's supposed to be done, and then I can sort of take a deep dive into how we're making the decisions that I think are wrong. And some of the times we'll find that it's because there's some, factor that we're not taking into account. And sometimes it's just because things are just not quite tuned right.
Okay. That's very interesting. That's good unit test practice. Um, so then, I guess, how do you decide the weights of like the actual number part of it, right?
So like you mean the difficulty number or the costs for the?
The cost for various things.
Yeah. So that we have I've got like 40 or 50 different tunable parameters that represent how much these different, techniques, be it hitting multiple things with one foot or crossing or double stepping or jacks or foot switches or hole anchors or all these things in different configurations, how they impact the cost. Um, and if the cost for crossovers is wrong, then you'll see the thing making either decisions that it should cross things where it should double step or it should double step when it should cross. And so a lot of these costs end up being coupled together fairly tightly, like cross versus double step, for example. If I increase the cost of the crossover, now it's going to start double stepping, so I have to up the cost of the double stepping, and that's going to cause jacks to get the wrong answer because that's tied to jacks and just a whole bunch of things. And so it ultimately the cost, it's just tuned to get the patterns right.
Okay. Because I think a lot of people kind of treat like this algorithm, at least when they like talk about it, as like this objective thing that needs to happen. And like you do have subjective costs to it. Like they're grounded in reason, but they are ultimately like subjective at the end.
Sure, and there's actually a little bit more to that subjectivity than I think is maybe necessarily obvious, because I've definitely seen there are places, I can think of one chart in particular that has a section where it's got like some sort of eighth notes, and then there's like a tiny little break, and then there's three notes that you would be crossed, and then another tiny break, and then more eighth notes. And depending on the exact tuning, that keeps switching back and forth between choosing to double step into it to avoid the cross and then double step out of it, versus doing it as a cross. And because there's the breaks right before and after, like it's a really open-ended question, would you cross this? And I think a lot of different people would have different answers to that. So it's not even just that our choices are subjective here, as I don't think there is an objective answer. There's not necessarily a right answer to every question. There's a lot of places where there's like things that are just obviously wrong. There's a lot of places, particularly in 9-panel, where things are, there's just so many more, or even 18-panel double. There's just so many more panels and different patterns that how you do it is not necessarily as obvious, or, different people would do it differently. And I think there's more variation, a much more smooth variation there. Another good example would be if you have like left, down, 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 right. You can do that as a jack or a foot switch, and either way you'll end up not crossed because it's three in a row. Like that's a case where, and like the previous case I was talking, you could cross or double step, but there's gaps on either side, so it really just doesn't matter what you choose. Like it's, it's a particularly nice double step location, and if it was constant eighths, we'd almost certainly analyze it as crossovers, but the breaks in between really just like, I don't think always alternate under all circumstances unless you absolutely can't is the right way to analyze patterns.
Okay.
Like, I don't think that's accurate to how people play.
So what's the state of it at then? Like it's pretty good. Are you like pretty content with it?
I'm really happy with it overall. So in our testing suite, I only have one chart that analyzes incorrectly for any part of it, and that's a very interesting chart. And this particular part where it gets it wrong, there's a part where your left foot is like just alternating back and forth between left and down left while your right foot isn't doing anything. And then your right foot does the same thing. And then afterwards, there's like, right after that, you're like holding it with one foot and alternating the other, and then holding with the other foot. So like it gets the hold plus alternate right, but like the just like going back and forth between your left and down left, it treats those as crossovers. And that is definitely not how a player would actually play it.
Oh, absolutely not. That's not even close.
Yeah.
That's funny.
So I've sort of looked at it, but like that's not a huge priority, fixing that one tiny thing, because it's like a really weird edge case, and it's also partly related to like the notes are hold, so it thinks like you're supposed to hit the other tap like right as you've just released the hold, so your foot has just been used essentially according to our algorithm. So like it's more of a quick movement than if you hadn't been holding. There's sort of a lot of things that end up going into why we don't get that right. But like so I don't know if you've heard of the technique swishes. That's where you're like holding a panel with a foot, and then you like move your heel to a different panel, and then hold that and release your toe and hit something else, and you just sort of like swivel back and forth. Like
that doesn't exist in 4-panel.
No, we get those right. Like we get a lot of hold based stuff correct.
That's cool.
It's just like some weird edge cases where one foot is double stepping while the other foot isn't touching any panel at all. Like we get that wrong. There's some other places, not in terms of the pattern analysis, but one of our more infamous charts is referred to as jump rope. It's an 18-panel chart where you've got like mines sweeping back and forth, and then you've got like a jump here and then a jump here, and then like jump over the mines. And our mine handling basically looks for mines either before or after the tap on the same panel. But this is a case, like, I mean, there's other places where we need to improve this. Like, you could have to hit the center panel and have mines on up, down, left, and right, and you've got to be, like, really precise with where you're hitting there. But, like, this is a case, the jump rope thing, where there are mines coming up on the panel you're on, and there's no panel that's safe to go to. Like, if you want to jump to avoid them and then, like, do it as a quick jump, like, to not just hang yourself in the air for a while, you've got to land and then re-jump to hit the actual note. So you've got to do, like, extra pseudo jumps, or you've got to jump really high and hold yourself in the air, like, to hang in the air long enough until the actual next note comes up. And it ends up just being exhaustingly tiring, and our algorithm gives it a fairly low difficulty number because, like, we don't take into account there are mines everywhere, nothing is safe.
Yeah.
We don't account for that yet. So, like, there's some things that still need improvement, but, like, overall, it does a really good job, even with, like, really abstract, bizarre patterns with weird time spacing, and yeah, it's in a pretty good state.
That's very interesting. So, like, how do you deal with people complaining about the difficulties being wrong?
My normal response to that is, if you think a difficulty is wrong, difficulties don't exist in a vacuum. That means when you say you think it's wrong, that means you think chart X it has some rating, and you think another chart is either easier than it but rated higher, or harder and rated easier. And if you can show me those and tell me why you feel that way, then I will look at it.
Okay, but if they don't do that due diligence, it's just...
If they just say, I think this chart is wrong with no context as to, like, whether they think it's... I mean, they might say they think it's rated too high or too low, but, like, our system is, like, is only relative to our own system. So if you don't give me a comparison as an example of what you think it's hard relative to, then I can't work. There's nothing I can do with that information.
Okay, so then... Also, another thing that I probably should have asked beforehand, your rating, when it talks about the difficulty of a chart, a thing that a lot of new players kind of get caught up on is that in ITG, it's based on how hard it is to pass, not how hard it is to score on. Does your rating system work the same way, or is it?
It does. It's mostly based on physical difficulty. That doesn't necessarily always work great at the very low levels, and that's something I want to still try to do a better job at. In particular, like, if the notes are spaced far enough apart that you're barely, like, stepping faster than a walking speed, like, the physical difficulty isn't really going up when you're adding, like, a tiny bit of extra speed because it's so slow. But if you're just learning to play dance games, and the extra difficulty of reading the notes a little closer together ends up being somewhat significant, and we don't do a very good job accounting for that right now.
Yeah, I'm sure there's, like, nothing but random weird edge cases you can consider yourself that people don't actually do. You probably don't pay attention to what's happening in, like, Stamina Nation or stuff like that. They have difficulty ratings discussions all the time. It's, like, weird. It's like a follicular time thing. Like, I went on AIJ to search some theme stuff for a different interview, and, like, I found a thread of you and, like, other people talking about difficulty in, like, the exact same way that people talk about difficulty right now. So
I'm not surprised that problem hasn't gone away. I don't think it can without an algorithm, as long as it's just purely subjective. Like, so an algorithm to some degree is subjective, but it's consistent. You can't get different answer from two different people.
what is, I guess, your philosophy around user-created content and mods in the game?
Yeah, so that's a great question. It's sort of depends on the specific area. Like our game is designed very much. One of the things we wanted to capture was, I guess I didn't talk about this earlier in terms of sort of some of the goals with Rhythm Horizon, but with official game or official commercially released games, the content is always pre-decided by the people who make the game. But people making custom content often have like a lot of really cool and creative ideas. So we wanted to kind of get the best of both worlds there, where we let people make their own charts, and then our official content for Rhythm Horizon is hand-picked, curated from the stuff that people make. So it's not us sitting on like some ivory tower saying this is what you're gonna play. It's really the community like making the charts and saying what they like to play, and then we pick from that and try and construct something that has a sufficient variety and is competitively relevant, but is also fun and community involved. So like we are clearly, at least in that area, interested in community, people created content. We want also to be able to, and this is sort of a longer term thing, but allow community created note skin support. That is not currently in the game because the note skin system in general isn't fully finished. And one of my big things here is that once we allow users to make something, we have to maintain compatibility from then indefinitely. So we do not currently have we have a tiny bit of a gimmick system. We have warps is our only gimmick right now, because it's a weird only gimmick to have.
Yeah, was that like a free and implementation type of deal, or like?
No, so when I was designing our content system, I really didn't like the way Stepmania handled warps. So I was trying to think of a better way to do it, and I came up with the idea to have our note data include layers. And that layer system serves a whole bunch of different useful purposes. So warps work by like you have notes in a layer and you see the notes, and then you just turn the layer off and those notes disappear. And then you have notes in a different layer that's off, and then you just turn the layer on and those notes appear. And so like it's a really elegant way to do warps with like you can take a layer and turn it on and off and on and off, and you see the notes flashing in and out. So like that ends up being a really cool way to do that, I think. Layers are also useful for other things like routine type charts. Layer number, like the layer gets a player number, and that chooses which layer goes to which player, and then they can be colored or note skinned appropriately. Even for just like chart development, you can if you're not sure what you want to do with some section, you can write it twice in two different layers and just switch between them, having them both in the same chart. So like the concept of layers ends up being really useful. But that's like really deeply nested in our system as a whole, so that's that we have warps when we don't have any other visual effects.
That's funny. I like that cute little coincidence.
But the rest of the stuff, like it's an issue. Like I have some ideas for how I want like other visual effects to work, but I need to make sure this like there are no. I need to really spend a lot of time going over the system, make sure there are no holes or like things that are completely missed or that like just don't work out right. Because once I let people start messing with it, I can't just remove it out from under them. If people put in the effort, I want that effort to I want what they've created to still be viable long term.
How much do you like when you're designing something, like a new feature or like how you want to support something in the future? How much do you look at the existing implementation in the ITG community for something like that?
I don't.
Okay.
Like I don't even know if like a lot. So most of the features we have in general are based on me playing and saying, oh, this thing's frustrating me. I could make it better if we did this. And then, that sort of, I think about all the sort of side effects of that, and it evolves into its own system in some way, shape, or form. Occasionally will get suggestions from people on like, can you implement this kind of a feature? and sometimes those come from other games. But I do not look at what other games are doing. I I just don't.
Okay.
Our content system as a whole is actually designed fairly differently, and in large part to solve a lot of the problems that I perceive with the Stepmania system. So their content system is directory based. You have like a folder that is a pack, and in that you have folders that are songs, and in that you have a file that has the song and all of the chart information. Um, that has several problems with it. One is to people edit the content system by just dragging and dropping folders around, and then the game has to look for new stuff every time it launches, and that's slow. And also you have some song here, and then you're making a pack and you want to make your own chart to it. You make a copy of the song and put that somewhere else. If there's a tournament, you'll end up with 2 copies of the exact same song with the exact same chart. Now you've got like 6 copies of this song. You realize there's a sync error. You want to go fix it. You've got to fix it in 6 different places, and other people don't have the fix. Our content system works completely differently here. So we have like all of the different pieces are detached from each other, and then they each just have a unique identifier. It's just the like 128-bit number basically. And so a chart knows the ID of the song it goes to, and a pack has a list of chart IDs. So you can share charts without the song. The song doesn't know what charts it has, like in the wild. It just knows on your system what charts are there for it. And then you can just take that chart ID and put it in like 6 different packs, and it's just the same chart. You have one chart file. Okay. It doesn't have to be in any packs. You can upload the chart by itself. You download a pack. It knows what charts are in it. It then goes downloads the charts. Breaking things up this way sort of adds a lot of niceties. Currently, we don't support user custom songs, only charts. Once we're out of beta, we will be allowing people to locally import their own songs and export them if they want to share them, but they won't be on our server. Our server is only going to have the songs we have licensed, which we can legally share with anybody. And the only charts you can upload are the charts to the songs that we can distribute, because if you put a chart on the server but the song isn't there, then nobody can actually get the chart to play. So
that makes perfect sense. What was your favorite feature that you worked on for Rhythm Horizon?
So I don't know that I could pick out an individual favorite, but I can run through some of them real quick that I'm quite happy with.
Okay.
So I talked a little bit about the content system in general and the way things are broken apart and the way that lets you like share individual pieces of content without having to share whole packs and everything. That system I'm very happy with and has worked out really well overall. There's a couple of rough edges that I don't love, but in general, I really like that system. The other thing was designed to be very fast. Like our loading speeds are somewhat ridiculous. At a rate of like 10,000 charts per second loading from 100,000 charts per second loading from cache. So it's like it was designed to scale to like current. You've built up content for 20 years for Stepmania. You convert it all over to RH, and it's going to load in 2 seconds.
That's awesome.
So that's one of them. The difficulty analyzer, and really the pattern analysis is the part I'm more happy with than the overall difficulty. I think the overall difficulty numbers are pretty good, but the pattern analysis I think is a harder problem. I'm very happy with that. Some sort of like random other miscellaneous things, like our note skin system. We've separated how notes are colored versus the note skin. So each note skin is responsible for providing 8 different, we call them frames. They're usually colors, but they can be different shapes or whatnot. And so the player can, you pick your note skin, but then you can separately choose, do I want it rhythm colored or panel colored, or we have, an analytic color mode, which shows which foot our pattern analyzer thinks you'll use for each note. We have like a vertical option where like the ups, centers, and downs are colored differently. Horizontal, lefts, rights, and centers are colored differently. I think that's a pretty cool way to approach that. Our practice mode. So we have 3 different practice modes. One of them is just you sort of play normally, but you can like pause and navigate through the chart, whatever, while you're doing it. One is autoplay, and that's not very interesting. But the third one, I call it pattern mode. And in pattern mode, when you go to it, it'll just zoom straight to the first note, and when you hit the first note, it'll zoom to the next note, And when you hit the next note, it'll zoom to the next
Oh,
one. So you can just play through it at whatever speed you're comfortable with to like feel out the patterns. And as you're going through, when you think you did it and it didn't zoom to the next note, you look down at your feet and see where they are. And like
Oh, so
you
you do
can
the
like
mental
see what
calculus.
you did wrong. Like you don't have to like try and like record a video or like look at the
Hmm.
our exam and shit to see what you were hitting. You can just like
yeah.
look at your feet.
That's
And
really
so
That's
that
cool.
really
that
cool.
ends up being really cool for learning new patterns. Um, the way we handle score tracking in general is also, I think, really cool. We upload scores, but the scores we upload, we actually upload a full replay of your playthrough. So it includes like every judgment and their offset, but also every input, both press and release. And
Hmm.
so we can have the server generate screenshots of your scores for you. And when you get a world record, it automatically posts a screenshot of that score to our Discord channel. We're working
I
on
noticed
ways
that.
to let you share uh, non-record scores to Discord. From that same replay file, we can generate a replay video and potentially upload that to your YouTube channel for you. Um, we have the
Oh, that's
technology to
really
have the
cool.
server just like put together a video of it. And you can also download a replay and watch the replay, someone else's replay. Those same things allow you to do comparative scoring, so you can like compare to your rival's score and like see as you're playing note by note what the score difference is. So the way we handle that stuff is pretty nice. It adds a lot of functionality.
Yeah, it's cool. Yeah, every time I hear about like a new feature that Rhythm Horizon has, I'm like, wow, that's really cool.
I guess I'll also call it our technique analysis, which is uh, it's in our algorithm technically a separate pass from the pattern analysis. The pattern analysis chooses which foot hits which panel, and then the technique analysis goes through and pulls out what are the jacks, foot switches, crossovers,
Hmm.
stomps, which is the new name we're trying to give to brackets.
Stomps.
Brackets is
Yeah,
not
Yeah.
a great name. Um,
yeah. I
we
guess
have
I guess.
you don't have brackets on your pads, right?
No, we don't. And it's kind of weird to try and explain what that means. But anyways, like so we pull out information for those, but the way we actually do it is since it's done as part of our difficulty algorithm, we do it in a way that's weighted based on how relevant the technique is to the chart. So like if you had, 128 note eighths that have crossovers followed by 128 notes of 24th stream, the crossover value for that is going to be much lower than if you had 128 notes of eighths with no crossovers followed by 128 notes of crossover 24ths because they show up in a harder part of the chart. So the scaling is semi-arbitrary,
Interesting.
but it's normalized to the overall difficulty of the chart. But it gives you an idea of how much that
Hmm.
Mhm.
technique contributes to the like meaningful difficulty of the chart, rather than just how much does it show up at all.
Yeah, that's
Yeah,
cool.
that's interesting.
And you
Is
can
that
search and sort by those techniques, including search for things
oh,
on our server that have heavy crossovers or no crossovers, and you can filter that stuff out if you don't want any crossovers.
That's very cool. That part's very cool because I know there's some people who absolutely won't do a crossover in their life and refuse to.
So actually, to tie a couple things back together, I was talking earlier about like a particular pattern I know of where there's like a break and then three supposedly cross notes and then a break, and like it keeps going back and forth between double step or cross. I've been thinking about adding an extra sort of feature where you can add a personal bias and it will reanalyze with your bias. So when you sort, like, so for example, if you said bias towards crossovers, then it would say this part's a crossover. If you said bias against crossovers or for double steps, then it would say you double step this. But that would be relevant in terms of like if you want to filter out if you don't ever want to do a crossover, well, first nine panel, that's not always an option. Like down left plus up left, you don't really have a choice. Um,
mhm.
but like there are places like this where you it sort of could really easily go either way. So we could, set it up so that you can choose like I never want to do a crossover, so analyze as if it didn't have crossovers, or analyze don't cross unless you really have to. And then if
Mhm.
you did that and filtered out crossovers, like you would still get some things that you could reasonably double step, and like a single, you know, slow cross wouldn't show up as a, this chart is now hidden from you.
That's very interesting. Do you have that? Do you have like a player analysis on there? Like it kind of like judges how good you are at the various techniques.
Not currently.
Okay. I always thought that was a cool thing that SRPG, which is the system they have, it kind of creates this roadmap of progression for the players. So it's very easy to be like, oh, what should I try next? Oh, this next thing in this like the RPG type of thing. And I think something like that would be very useful for tech as well.
Yeah. So we've actually talked about some things related to that to some degree, because tech is a lot more relevant in 9-panel. There's just so many more techniques. And at least in our season pack, a lot of the stuff is technique driven. Like there are some straightforward charts, but there's a lot of stuff that's pretty heavy in some technique or another. And so initially we put together like a season one. We planned to have different seasons and scores tied to seasons and whatnot. But initially we were also going to have just a beginner pack that was outside the season packs. And that was not necessarily going to change when the seasons do, but the idea was people who are, I guess it wasn't like super well formed exactly what it was going to be, because it was kind of an amalgamation of people who are new to dance games, people who are new to 9-panel, people who are just new to these techniques. We were sort of throwing it all in there. We've been talking more recently about splitting it up so we can have like a pack like, I've never played dance games before, you should start here. I've played other dance games but never played 9-panel, try this pack. I want to learn more, focus on specific techniques. We'd have some, pre-curated packs for that. That isn't necessarily, doing recommendations, but that is, we are aware that is a relevant, interesting, valuable thing to be able to do. So we are doing some movement in that direction.
Awesome. That actually kind of brings up this next question. Nice little transition. What is in the future for Rhythm Horizon at this point?
Sure. So hardware is obviously in the future, and that's sort of our hope is that, I know a lot of people, or not many people, are playing Rhythm Horizon these days, and at least some of that is because of lack of hardware. I understand that there are some people who just won't be interested in 9-panel, but I think there are plenty of people who are that just don't have access to it. So we're expecting things to get a lot more exciting once the hardware's out there and more people are able to play. In large part because we are, our content is intended to be community driven. More people playing means more people can be generating content also, and just seeing more people have fun gives us even more motivation to work on it. So of course there's that, but like we have, in addition to that, we do have a lot of features that we're planning and discussing. We have some fairly significant UI work that's going on behind the scenes that encompasses but is not limited to expanding to higher resolutions. As sort of a funny aside, when we were first starting this project, we were trying to decide what we were going to do in terms of resolution. And at the time, we weren't even sure that we'd be able to drop 640 by 480 because people were playing on like standard ITG cabinets, and that was the resolution of the monitors, and people weren't like willing to go to flat screens yet, and it was somewhat reasonable at the time because they weren't as low latency back then as they are now. But like even when we did eventually like land on, yes, we're going to drop 640 by 480, like we did a poll of like people who seemed like they might be interested, and a lot of people only had 720p monitors, and so we were like, okay, we're going to go with 720p because that's like a modern aspect ratio, but still lets basically anybody use it. And it was much simpler for a lot of reasons to go with a single resolution than to try and support a bunch of resolutions. But we are doing that work to support more resolutions currently. But we also have a lot more social features in mind. I mentioned at some point that we have technology to you get a score and we can upload the screenshots of that score, that the server puts together the screenshot and you can post it places. Currently that's our Discord, but we'll be able to link your social media accounts to your Rhythm Horizon account, and if you want to like post it to your Twitter, we should be able to do that. You click a button in the game and the server posts a screenshot to your Twitter wall or feed or whatever it's called. Or uploads a video of
features. Clearly you don't even use Twitter.
No, I don't.
It's okay, I don't either.
Yeah. Something about TikTok, I don't know. Uploads a replay of whatever you played or wherever. We're talking about like an in-game chat or at least messaging system. We've even, with our chart editing, we have part of the technology put together to allow like joint editing sessions. So you could like two people could be working like simultaneously in a joint session on the same chart.
That's a big one. There is demand for that in
Is there?
the ITG community. There's a demand for that. No one's done that yet. So
That's good to know. So like I said we have some of the technology in place. At some point quite a while ago, I put together a system for our editor that we can basically serialize to memory or no, to disk, like every action that you do that changes anything. Like they're all individually encapsulated. They know how to undo themselves. So we have a really long undo buffer. But when you like close the game or even exit the editor, it'll take your entire undo buffer and just write it to disk. And when you go back to the editor, it'll like load it back up. And so you get your undo history after you've left the editor and come back. I think that's generally a very useful, nice thing to have. But the ability to like take these individual actions and serialize them, and they can undo themselves also. So you could like, if two people, you could like send your action serialized to the other player, and they could send their action back to you just over the network. And if they happen to occur in different orders, like you could undo one, do the other one, and then redo the one you had already done. And so we can like get things ordered properly and just send individual changes back and forth.
That's so fun.
So the infrastructure for that is like in place. We just don't have the network side of it.
That's so fun. That's such a cute feature. I don't mean that like in a meaning it's not.
I know what you mean.
Yeah, that's good. That makes me smile. Do you support SM files, like exporting SM files?
No, we do not.
Okay.
So that's one of the things that's going to come with our actual release, which is essentially when the hardware is ready. That's what we're calling release, is when the hardware is out. We are going to open source the files behind our content system. So anybody who wants will be able to go and write their own converter, but that's not going to be our responsibility to maintain compatibility. And when like our game rules and our note types are not the same and don't behave the same way, it's not our problem to solve. If you want to convert our content to Stepmania or convert Stepmania content to our game, you can figure out how you're going to resolve those differences.
Okay.
So it'll be open. People can do that, but we're not going to be the ones maintaining.
How do you, I guess, balance things that are like, oh, the community is going to create and fill this gap versus this is something that we have to do as like the Rhythm Horizon dev team?
It sort of depends on the area. Like, so an example of where we have obviously taken community contributions is the content we have. There have been times when like Clara or myself will go and write some charts. Like we have some gaps. We need like more crossover charts in this difficulty, or just like more whatever. And so we'll try to fill in some of the gaps that the community hasn't managed to handle. In terms of like the development of the overall game, there's not a ton. It's more difficult for people to contribute. That's more of the type of thing where an individual person, if they were willing to devote a large amount of effort, we'd be willing to like let them help with the project. But it's not the type of thing that like somebody could come in and do a tiny bit and then somebody else can come in and do a tiny little piece. We have a couple people who help us cut and sync songs. There's community involvement in terms of music licensing. We take suggestions, and we also, some musicians will come to us and it's like, hey, I'm working on this. If I finish it, would you want it? And if we say yes, then they do it, and then we license it from them. That's happened several times. So, there's some community involvement there, but I think that's at the current time essentially the limit of it.
Okay.
Well, I guess there's also like in terms of community reporting bugs is very, very helpful to us. A lot of we try to have good tests for the things we can, and I try to when I work on things we can't easily have good tests for to make sure they work. But there's a lot of different systems in the game, and it's easy to miss things sometimes, particularly UI testing and testing with like certain download upload as different user functionality. So there are just some situations where it's not easy to have robust automated testing ensuring that like the user gets a good experience at the end. So like we really value feedback we get on that.
Okay, cool. Well, we'll cut it off there. Thank you very much for answering all my questions.
Yeah. It's been fun.
Hell yeah, lots of fun. Bye.